Now,
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
good evening. My name is Josam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the illustrious Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Well,
it's great to see you again.
Glad to be here, but every time you start throwing these adjectives around, I look over my shoulder to see who you're talking about.
You know, we had the recent political upheaval in Alabama. I just wonder if there's not some place for you in the American pantheon of political operatives. No?
I would like to hide under the covers until it's all over.
You seem to summons up tremendous political figures appear episodically. Well, good. We can talk about a lot of things. I think tonight maybe we could discuss a little bit the influence of the media on our culture, our country. Where is that going? Where is it taking the American people? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Now, if we look in American history, certainly the media has become, how can one say it, a lot more powerful, a lot more incisive. It's with us constantly, this 24-hour news cycle. But there's always been the impact of, shall we say, newspapers in the late 18th century, the start of our country. We've had the impact of media, a printed page. What was that like in earlier days? Comments?
Yes, well, I think that the story really properly begins when movable type gets to Europe in the mid-1400s. That kicked off everything from the Protestant Reformation to censorship, and it was a fascinating time. By the late 1700s, you did not have of course did not have wire services, you did not have big media corporations or conglomerates. You had a lot of small newspapers, mom and pop operations with small circulations. And the papers would borrow from each other, they would reprint other newspapers. Probably one of the best examples of something being published in a newspaper in the 1700s would, of course, be the Federalist Papers, those newspaper articles published in New York by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And they were picked up and reprinted by other newspapers in a kind of ripple effect as they spread outward. One interesting thing is that a large city might have several newspapers, and that the newspapers were unabashedly partisan, very conservative or very liberal. They made no bones about it whatsoever. Their editorial views affected the news. There was no distinction between news and editorializing. And I think that was a good thing, because the well-rounded person could buy newspapers on both ends or all ends of the spectrum and read them and compare them to each other and then make up his own mind. And really, by the time you get the big newspaper conglomerates of the late 20th century, that was much harder to do.
Well, one can think about these things. The literacy rates might not have been so great in early American world. Rural countries, the impact of print took a while to be disseminated. Stories were a bit old, but I take your point. The development of contemporary newspapers sort of proceeded along, I believe, and I'm reminded of the Spanish-American War and the impact of Randolph Hearst and the yellow journalism of the time. And I think he's the big man that started the little war, but he basically, it's been said, the power of the press was enough to actually start a whole war. Do you have comments about that? And I mean, what transpired there?
Yes, and that's really when the News Corporation came of age. By the sometime between the 1860s and the 1890s, you had various legal and technological developments that gave the media that kind of clout. First of all, you had the development of the telegraph and the high-speed printing press that was driven by steam and then by electricity. And that meant by the 1880s, certainly by the 1890s, you had something that you never could have had before in history. You could have a single newspaper editor, a single features writer, a single author could write a single article, a single editorial, and by the power of the telegraph and the high-speed press, that could be disseminated nationwide within 24 hours. And so the next day after writing, literally tens of millions, scores of millions of people from coast to coast could get up and read the same article and be influenced by that one individual's thought. And not just technologically, but the corporation that managed to create a national newspaper chain with all of these different newspapers being owned by the same individual, Hearst or Pulitzer, for instance.
Well, we're sort of taking our journey through the impact of media on American culture. One of the things that happened directly after World War I was developing radio. So we had the ability to come into everyone's home became extraordinary. There's a certain distance, I think, between the printed page and the reader.
Yes.
There's a certain distance. One can put the book down and walk around, come back, reread things. So the information arrangement is different than in listening to a radio program. Yes. One has to be there. The oratorical ability, the music of the person giving the speech on the radio is very powerful and very different and more seductive.
Yes.
So you can I think about the dictators, their use of, particularly Hitler, use of radio, and then American political figures, how well they used it. Franklin Roosevelt certainly was a tremendous orator over the radio, and the ability to influence people, it seems to me, to become more and more obvious with that development.
Yes, it's a connection of the personality and the way someone sounds, the way his accent is, what he emphasizes. And Roosevelt was a natural with that. Commercial broadcast radio came into being in America actually during the presidential election night of 1920, station KDKA Pittsburgh. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, was running as the Democratic vice presidential nominee during that election. And within 10 years' time, it was hard to find any middle class or up home in America that did not have a radio in it. And so Roosevelt was a natural figure for the radio, and his fireside chats gave him the ability to, in effect, propagandize the American people. That was one reason he was able to stay in power as long as he did, because he was such a natural with it.
Well, and you've mentioned an important word, propaganda. And the idea is that this media, the power of the media is increasing, and politicians are aware of it, advertisers are aware of it, and in any kind of national conflict, the government makes use of the media to influence public opinion and to give a particular viewpoint about national policy. And certainly World War II, there was a tremendous ability to do that, not only with radio, newspapers, and then also movies. So the theater, propaganda movies were made by all sides.
Yes.
Leni
Riefenstahl, for instance,
right,
Triumph
tremendous.
of the Will.
So,
yes.
And there's some kind of irrational connection that can take place with images in the brain. If one is trying to parse out an argument in the Federalist, the different nuances of what's said, that's one thing. But to actually be impacted by the light, the camera, the music, one can be quite easily seduced, I think, by the media in these circumstances.
Indeed. Well, I mentioned Leni Riefenstahl briefly in her propaganda film Triumph of the Will, which was a documentary of Hitler and the Nazi phenomenon, which was interesting because she was not herself a Nazi. But it was interesting because you could see the psychological links that the Nazis went to get into the heads of the people. Having torchlight parades at 2 in the morning when your psychological resistance is lowest, when Hitler comes out onto the podium and he says nothing for a minute or two. He simply consults his notes, he postures, he poses. You don't need the media to do any of that, but if you do have the media, if you film it and then distribute this film, you have a far greater audience being affected by these by this behavior, this Stone Age just biological behavior of posturing.
And then we go into the world of television.
Yes.
So television is in everyone's living room every night, and particularly when there were just a few major television networks, their impact on the Vietnam War or on any viewpoint, civil rights, you could say, was the ability to take a picture of an event and then put it in everyone's home, and sometimes with a spin and sometimes with not. But that was a very influential methodology that was out there.
Yes. Well, on the eve of two things. On the eve of Vietnam, first of all, the generation that grows up immediately after World War II, the baby boomers, get to see the abuse of power on television. I remember when I was in 3rd grade seeing a picture of a little boy being helped across an intersection by a policeman, smiling, friendly man in uniform. So the police is our friend to serve and protect. But against that is the pictures you see on the television screen of the nice, friendly men in uniform using fire hoses and police dogs on little black children in the South. And so the baby boomers who are watching this get the idea that authority is not good, it is evil. And then when this authority drafts them to go fight in Vietnam, you see the resistance. But also on the eve of Vietnam, one of the big moments of television, the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates of 1960. You still had a very large radio audience in 1960, and people who heard the debates on radio said that Nixon did a better job. People who saw the debates on television saw Nixon with his 5 o'clock shadow, sweating profusely because he had just been ill with the flu, wearing a gray flannel suit that faded into the background compared to the young, vibrant Kennedy in his dark suit. People who saw it said that Kennedy won. Image was everything.
So I think we've sailed the ship a substantial distance. Now, maybe one of the things to discuss is the ability of people to manipulate Americans with the media.
Yes.
So if you want to do that, you have you've mentioned some of the techniques that could occur. In a day when the printed word was the major source of information, then one could parse arguments out, could say yes, no, that's good, that's bad. But the emotional impact of television or anything where vision is involved is so powerful that it seems to overawe the audience often. And one of the most important things, I think, is the message that the producers choose to put out there,
yes,
both on the right and the left and in the middle. If one says we're going to have a newscast tonight, and let's suppose we want to do something against Mexico. Our major mission is to do something bad against Mexico. Well, we have someone the Mexican police roughed up, so that person is on television. The next night is, I don't know, the Mexicans have done something terrible to Guatemalans. They have a person. There could be just a series of events, and there are no numbers. So it's not as if we have this. Well, sure, the Mexican police did something, but it's one case in 29 million, and the U.S. It's 1 in 10 million. Or there are no statistics, no numbers, no issues of causality. Often just a 30-second blurb of one thing or another. And the other thing that happens is that if you really want to get a message, I'm just picking Mexico as I happen. I think I like Mexico, but just pick any subject you like, and you could just make it repetitious. So apparently Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, his idea was you just keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over again, because you don't want to make things complicated for your listeners. You want just one fact out there. And in truth, the normal person that walks the street has a hard time just understanding everything. Life is complicated enough. These facts are difficult to understand, and so the idea is the media is going to interpret what's out there and dissect the message and then send it out to the listeners, and in many ways just persuade them for a particular viewpoint. and the listener often has a hard time of picking his path through this, I guess I would say.
Yes. Well, I think there are a couple of problems here. And the first problem is, and it would be interesting to see exactly when this started, but the idea of journalism as a profession. I would gather that it started sometime no earlier than the late 19th century and probably a little bit after that. But you would think that if journalism sees itself, or media presence sees itself as a professional undertaking, then it should be unbiased, it should be disinterested, it should be detached. And this is certainly the way I think most media outlets do represent themselves. And one large media outlet, which always its tagline is fair and balanced.
Yes.
My thought is, if you have to tell someone you're fair and balanced, perhaps you are not so fair and balanced.
Yes,
and
yes.
I'm not picking on that one in particular.
Right, yes,
I think
yes.
but I think the problem comes with, I mentioned in the late 1700s, the mom and pop newspapers made no pretense about their partisanship. Today, the large media outlets can be just as partisan, but they pretend not to be, and that is the dangerous combination.
And so we see that now in the country, and there's a lot of different viewpoints, different ideas that are afoot. There's a lot of issues in Washington about what side to take or what side not to take. And many times, if you're pursuing a career in journalism, what is it that's going to propel you to the top? And there are a lot of things that would do that. One is to be in sync with the owners of the press or the newspaper. So or the TV station. So occasionally I've seen one TV figure on a conservative station or a conservative network, and then for whatever reason they go to another one, and their viewpoints just flip 180 degrees
Yes.
to be in sync with the new ownership, which brings up the question about ownership of the media. That's a big deal, isn't it? So if you're a very wealthy person, as William Randolph Hearst was, you could sort of just pick the things you'd like to talk about or emphasize, and you have the power to do that. And I don't think that's understood enough as to how the ownership of a TV station or a network or a newspaper, what that does to the editorial content or in general the way the news is presented.
Yes, and that's always a problem. And once again, if it's portraying itself as unbiased, and yet there is a bias, even perhaps an unrecognized bias, somewhere in the organization, probably at the very top, as you indicate, that's not a good thing. I think it's a bad thing. And another problem is the emotional aspect that you talked about, showing a bloody person beaten up or something like that. The best example of that comes to mind is the Eddie Adams photo of the Tet Offensive and
Yes.
someone being shot. But I don't know if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape letters.
I have, as a matter of fact.
But of course, when Screwtape is telling his nephew Wormwood how to go about this, he says, you're not supposed to teach. You don't want to develop the patient's ability to think, because once the patient is thinking for himself, you don't know where that's
Yes.
going to lead.
Yes.
You want to lead him. You don't want logic to lead him, because you may get a result that you, as the pusher,
Yes.
doesn't like.
Well, isn't that sort of, I'm just looking at our national dialogue now. It seems the stories that are discussed or the issues that are of consequence, there's a sort of a gotcha thing on each side. And you could say the Democrats are trying to make some kind of statement about Russian influence in the election, and maybe the Republicans, they're trying to, I guess, go after Hillary, even though Hillary's no longer in power. But they're just going back and forth and producing stories or sometimes even factitious stories about the person they dislike. And actually, the question that comes up, is that an appropriate thing the people in America need to know about? I mean, is it that important? This story isn't the important issue, whatever it is. You could I don't know. You could say climate change, or you could say the economy's getting better, or the dangers of I guess unemployment. the crime in the streets, whatever.
Well,
those
think,
issues
yes.
are not discussed really much at all, are they?
Well, you think those are important, but that brings up the question: what is important? Is there something that is objectively important, or is it what we decide is important? And who is we? Or, I mean, if the
well,
media,
I mean, I guess what I might get into would be if you were a major decision maker in regards to the world, you were the person that you had that ability to influence the world in the most telling of ways. It appears to me the message, the information you are getting should be the kind of information the American people are receiving. Instead, I think there's a certain kind of, I'll pick my word carefully here, a certain kind of joy in seeing your enemies cast down or seeing your team win. And their newspapers and TV and media try and solicit their viewership by using this candy, if you want to say it that way. So the Americans, whatever they were, it's the anniversary of victory against the Germans. So that's a lot of things to see. Or the bad guys, the communist statue is coming down in Warsaw. It appears to be a lot of that's what's happening, and there's just a little bit of time if you have a national TV show to put something out there. If you extract out the advertisements, one has to put out in say 20 minutes really extraordinary information for the American people in a 20-minute dose of something.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see the way they do that. And I'm asserting the dosage they put out or the message they put out is not really often a great consequence. I guess I would say that.
Yes. Well, there's so much news and there is so much ability now to gather information and intelligence. And that's an area that we haven't even really talked about at all. We've been talking about the big corporations, the centralized power, the ability to dictate if you will, a news agenda, which is what you're talking about here. But what about the internet? Which has really sort of returned or moved in the direction of returning power back to the mom and pop to be able to ferret out the stories that may not make that 20 minutes. It's democratizing news to a degree. And what effect is that going to have? What effect is that going to have on the media corporation? I mean, we're already seeing the great newspapers of America shutting down one by one. So what's next?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? So the impact of of the internet can be formidable. I think in the era of spring, the government controlled everything so tightly that the internet was how everybody did their deal. And I think in China now, the government controls the internet.
The Great Firewall.
Right, and I think also in North Korea, the government controls that.
Yes.
Which brings up the idea that, yes, that's a pretty good thing that we have that still existing. Now, the net neutrality on the internet, I mean, can you comment about that? Apparently, one of the things that's happening is the idea that all comers had sort of an equal say, and that was the Obama administration put those rules in, and apparently they're changing. Can you comment on that?
Yes, we are moving. There's a big debate over net neutrality, and that's essentially a matter of bandwidth. That if you are a bigger consumer, then you get preference. You get more free flow of information, and if you are smaller, if you're a more mom and pop organization, if you're an individual consumer, then your bandwidth may be throttled, and that's simply being driven by corporate economics, and that raises a whole host of questions. So.
Well, we're near the end of our little interchange tonight. I would just make one comment: is that where all of the information flow is controlled, and there's not any kind of countervailing opinions out there, it makes it extremely easy for a government to basically turn its citizens into automatons. And I think North Korea is probably a pretty good example of that. Almost any opinions are not allowed, and certain theocracies, particularly the Middle East, where just one opinion appears, that's very restraining. And people will respond to the information they receive, even if they're good people, nice, good, wonderful people. If they get a particular viewpoint that's given to them and they have no other way to have a different judgment. They're going to act as their informers wish them to act.
Yes. Well, and this is why we need different axes of information, and we need critical thinking skills. As my great mentor Jim Cox used to say when I was an undergraduate at Mercer University, if you don't think for yourself, someone else is going to think for you.
Well, on that note, Bucky, thank you for being here
Thank
today.
you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.